Hello everyone, Professor V here, and this is the Chapter 2 lecture for Biological Psychology. It has been said that the brain is the most complicated object in the known universe. Nevertheless, students in biological psychology must quickly develop at least an initial familiarity with the most complex of things because we can't really proceed to discussions of how the brain produces behavior without first describing what the brain is. This requires a deft touch. Too much rote memorization of the names of tracks and nuclei will have students reaching for the course calendar to see what else is available, but too little knowledge of neuroanatomy will preclude complete understanding of topics later on in the course. Chapter 2 will ease you into neuroanatomy by taking different points of view in succession in order to provide general background knowledge on the topic. Begin with a bit of review. Neurons are the basic cell that make up the nervous system. It consists of a soma or cell body, dendrites that receive electrochemical messages, and axons that transmit electrochemical messages. At the end of the axons are axon terminals, in which, when they come into contact with a dendrite, form a synapse. More on the neuron a little later. There are also non-neural cells called glial cells. They are supportive cells to the nervous system that provide structure, nutritional, and other types of support to the brain and nervous system, in which we will discuss more in depth later on in this lecture. The neuron doctrine is a hypothesis that proposes two things. One, cells of the brain are independent from one another structurally, metabolically, and functionally. This means that they do not physically touch one another, each have their own nucleus, and create their own electrical messages. And two, the information created is transmitted from one neuron to the next across tiny gaps. These tiny gaps are, as mentioned earlier, called synapses. This is where the electric part of the message becomes a chemical message. More on that later. You may have learned various parts of a cell in previous biology classes, whether it was in college or high school, and many of those parts you previously learned are also in neurons. The cell's nucleus is the spherical structure and the soma. It contains genes encoded in DNA. A neuron also contains mitochondria, which provides energy to the cell, and ribosomes, which is responsible for translating genetic instructions from the cell into proteins. But a neuron is also a very unique cell and contains many parts and performs functions that other cells do not. I've already named a few. Dendrites, axon, and axon terminals are unique to neurons. However, different structures also make up 4 different divisions of a neuron. A neuron's dendrite makes up the input zone. They receive information from other neurons across synapses. Synapses can also occur on the soma of a neuron, and thus the soma can also be part of the input zone. When a neuron is receiving messages from a previous neuron, the messages are accumulating in the soma. When the cell reaches its certain charge to fire its electrical message, it begins in the integration zone, which is at the very top part of the axon. This part of the axon is called the axon hillock. The axon makes up the conduction zone. The axon carries the cell's electrical messages away from the cell body. Before its end, the axon may split into multiple branches called axon collaterals. The axon terminals make up the output zone of the neuron. This is where the electrical message of a neuron is converted into a chemical message and goes to the next neuron via the synapse. To review the unique parts of a neuron, dendrites, part of the input zone that receive information from other cells. They have tiny swellings on them which synapses occur called dendritic spines. The soma, part of the integration zone, contains the nucleus and all DNA information. Messages from other neurons pass through the soma and accumulate at the axon hillock. The axon, part of the conduction zone, transmits a neuron's message from the soma down the axon to reach the axon terminals. and axon terminals, where the electrical message is converted into a chemical message and sent into the synapse to give another neuron a message. Here is a picture of what a neuron looks like, and you can clearly see the dendrites are at the top and form the input zone. There can be many dendrites or a single one depending on the type of neuron. More on types shortly. The integration zone is next. The part that is highlighted in red is the axon hillock. Next is the axon that is surrounded in a green fatty tissue called myelin. This is where the electrical message passes through. And lastly is the output zone and the axon terminals. As you can see, there are many axon terminals at the end of one axon. This is where the electrical message that traveled down the axon is converted into chemical messages. If you wanted to see how neurons look like with the naked eye, it would be incredibly hard. Actually impossible. You have to remember how small they are. However, histology, the scientific study of composition of tissue, uses fabric dyes to allow researchers to see microscopic structures. Here we see a Golgi stain, and you can see all the structures of the neuron. You can see some fine details, but the downfall is that it only highlights just a few neurons at a time. To see how many neurons are present in a given area, researchers use Nissl stains. In Nissl stains, the dye is attracted to the RNA within the cell and allows to see how many neurons are present in a small space. Because the dye is attracted to the RNA, it outlines the cell bodies of neurons. If you had trouble a few seconds ago to see structures of the neurons in the Golgi stain, a more updated use of Golgi stains uses fluorescent dye. As you can see, structures are more clearly seen. Now, as stated before, there are several types of neurons. Each look differently as well. Multipolar neurons are the most common type of neuron and exist in the brain and spinal cord. They have many dendrites to receive messages and one axon to transmit its messages, but still has many axon terminals. Thus, its message can be sent to multiple neurons at the same time. Bipolar neurons have a single dendrite that can branch off and a single axon on the other end. These are the types of neurons that are responsible for our sensory systems, such as vision. And lastly, unipolar neurons. The soma is in the middle and has one extension that leaves the soma. It branches off and goes into directions. One end is the input zone with branches like a traditional dendrite, and the other is the output zone. These types of neurons are used to transmit touch information from the body to the spinal cord. We can see here the three types of neurons we just went over. Notice that even though they are all shaped differently, they all have the same structural divisions of a neuron: the input zone, integration, conduction, and output zones. Also note that the unipolar neuron on the output zone, axon terminals, still exist. Now, the function types of neurons. The first is the motoneuron or motor neuron. These are neurons that govern your movements. They have long axons that synapse on muscles and cause them to contract in response to messages sent from the brain. They are also responsible for sending messages from the brain to organs and glands to control their functions. Sensory neurons do the opposite of motoneurons. Sensory neurons do the opposite of motoneurons. They send information from our environment to the brain and spinal cord. They take on many different shapes depending on what it is responsible for detecting. For example, vision is nothing but the processing of light in the brain. The sensory neurons responsible for responding to different amounts of light are shaped like rods and cones. We will discuss these in chapter 10. And lastly, interneurons. These make up the bulk of the neurons in the brain. It is responsible for receiving information from other neurons, processing it, and sending messages to different areas of the brain. These types of neurons have very, very short axons in comparison to sensory and motor neurons. They make up complex networks in the brain and perform complex functions in the brain, such as holding a memory intact, emotion regulation, processing of sound, and other complex functions. Now let's work on some more vocabulary words that I will be using throughout the semester. The presynaptic neuron is the neuron that is sending the electrical message down the axon. The postsynaptic neuron is the neuron that is receiving the message from the presynaptic neuron. The presynaptic membrane is the part of the presynaptic neuron where the chemicals enter the synapse. The postsynaptic membrane is the part of the postsynaptic neuron in which the chemical enters the postsynaptic neuron. The synaptic cleft is the space in between the presynaptic and postsynaptic membranes that the chemical pass through. Here you can see all the paths I mentioned on the previous slide. The yellow neuron is the presynaptic neuron. It is responsible for sending the message to the postsynaptic neuron. The blue one, if we zoom in, you can see the parts of the synapse and the synaptic membranes. This here is a synapse. It is made up of an axon terminal and dendritic spine. The yellow, again, is part of the presynaptic neuron. The mitochondria is providing metabolic energy for the cell processes. Now we also see a couple of new terms on this diagram. Synaptic vesicles are what hold the chemicals used in the messages when the electricity reaches the axon terminal. It forces these synaptic vesicles to fuse with the presynaptic membrane to release its chemicals into the synaptic cleft. I've been referring to these chemicals as chemicals, but the real term is neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitters cross the synaptic cleft and bind with receptors on the postsynaptic membrane. We will learn more about the receptors in just a moment. Again, the synaptic vesicles are tiny sacs in the axon terminals that store neurotransmitter molecules. When the electricity travels down the axon and reaches the axon terminals, these synaptic vesicles fuse with the presynaptic membrane and release neurotransmitter into the synaptic cleft. The neurotransmitter are the chemicals that serve as the basis of communication between two neurons. There are specialized proteins on the postsynaptic membrane that are responsible for receiving the neurotransmitter. In some neurons, instead of neurotransmitter, it is a hormone, but more on that in another chapter. The axon hillock is a cone-shaped swelling in which the axon originates out from the cell body. This is where neural messages accumulate, and once the messages reach a certain voltage called a threshold, the neuron fires its own electrical message. An axon collateral are branches of the axon in order to form many axon terminals at the end of the axon of a single neuron. An axonal transport is not necessarily a physical part of the neuron. It is a transportation of used materials back to the soma for recycling. Here's a diagram to show the differences between axons and dendrites. They are very different. Opposites, really. There is only one axon per neuron, while there are many dendrites per neuron. Axons are the same width from the axon hillock down to the axon collateral, while dendrites taper off to a point. Axons have a protective covering of fatty tissue called myelin to prevent the electrical signal from weakening from the axon hillock to the axon terminals, and dendrites do not have this sheathing. Axon length ranges from very long from the spinal cord all the way down to your feet to incredibly nearly non-existent, while dendrites are often just very short. Now let's discuss glial cells that we briefly touched on earlier this chapter. They're supportive cells to the nervous system that provide structure, nutritional, and other types of support to the brain and nervous system. There are several different types which are responsible for these different functions. They communicate with the neurons and directly affect neural functioning by providing neurons with raw materials and chemical signals that alter neuronal structure and excitability. There are several types of glial cells. Astrocytes are star-shaped and have many extensions that resemble dendrites that weave among neurons. Some connect neurons to blood vessels to regulate blood flow to provide more supplies to neurons when they are active. They also monitor the activity of neural processes. Astrocytes also play a role in the creation and pruning of synapses. Microglial cells help with injuries of the nervous system. When they come into contact with the site of damage, they form a spherical containment zone around the injury. They are also the trashmen of the nervous system, migrating to sites of injury or disease in the nervous system to remove debris from injured or dead cells. We've talked a bit about the protective sheathing around many axons called myelin. Myelin is provided by two types of glial cells, oligodendrocytes and Schwann cells. Oligodendrocytes provide myelin to multiple areas on axons of neurons in the central nervous system. Schwann cells, however, provide only one section of myelin on the axon in the peripheral nervous system. There are gaps left in between sections of myelin called nodes of Ranvier. The membrane of the axon is exposed in these areas and they serve a purpose, but more on that in the next chapter. Glial cells are not immune to disease. Unlike neurons, glial cells continue to divide throughout your lifetime to create new glial cells. There is a consequence. They may form many of the types of tumors that may arise in the brain. Where there is a brain injury, glial cells, especially astrocytes, respond by swelling. Astrocytes also directly influence local brain chemistry, so they may have been implicated in diseases that result from changes in neuronal excitability, such as epilepsy. Diseases that affect the myelin sheath that oligodendrocytes provide can have a detrimental effect as well. Multiple sclerosis, or MS, is the loss of myelin sheath from axons in various regions of the brain. This will cause the neurons to short circuit or provide a distorted message to the postsynaptic neuron. By the time the signal reaches its destination, it could be a totally different message if it ever reaches the destination. Switching to a more grander scale, let's discuss the divisions of the nervous system and then break them down. The central nervous system, or CNS, consists of the brain and spinal cord. The brain is the main processing center of the body. It receives its information from the peripheral nervous system, or the PNS. The PNS is the part of the nervous system that exists outside of the brain and spinal cord. It consists of nerves, which are bundles of axons that extend throughout the body. This is where motor neurons and sensory neurons exist that we discussed earlier. The PNS can be divided into three separate parts as well: the somatic nervous system, which contains the cranial and spinal nerves; the autonomic nervous system, which is responsible for automatic functioning; and the enteric nervous system, which is used in digestion. Here is a picture that depicts the CNS in blue, the brain and spinal cord, and the PNS in yellow, or is that green? I can't really tell. Let's just say not blue. The PNS travels throughout the entire body, connecting all body organs and systems to the central nervous system. The PNS travels throughout the entire body, connecting all body organs and systems to the CNS. While you see the cauda equina separated from the spinal cord, it's still part of it and continues downward inside the spinal column. Going back to the cranial and spinal nerves. The cranial nerves, even though they are in the head, are not part of the brain. They are part of the PNS. You have 12 pairs, several that we will cover throughout the semester in various chapters. They serve the sensory and motor systems of the head and neck. The nerves pass through small openings in the skull, directly entering or leaving the brain without ever joining the spinal cord. As for the spinal nerves, you have 31 pairs that emerge from the spinal cord that is part of the PNS. Each spinal nerve is named according to the segment of spinal cord to which it is connected: cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, or coccygeal. So we will refer to the spinal nerve that is connected to the 12th segment of the thoracic portion of the spinal cord as T12. The nerve connected to the 3rd segment of the sacral portion as S3, and so on. Fibers from different spinal nerves join to form peripheral nerves. Here are the 12 pairs of cranial nerves. The ventral view of the brain shows the cranial nerves and their primary functions. Blue represents sensory nerves, red represents motor nerves. For cranial nerves with both types of functions, separate axons within the nerve carry either motor or sensory information. We will cover several of these as the semester progresses. Here you can see the 31 pairs of spinal nerves and what they are connected to. These are the parts of the body that send and receive messages to or from the spinal cord. If the spinal cord is severed at a certain area, no feeling would occur from the area of the body it controls downward. The autonomic nervous system is part of the PNS that controls for automatic functioning that is unconscious to you, such as pumping of the heart, secretion of hormones into the blood, breathing, eye blinks, and a whole range of other bodily functions. Now you may say that you can control breathing and eye blink, but think about it. When you are not controlling it consciously, is it still occurring? Of course it is, because if you didn't breathe when you weren't thinking about breathing, well, you know what would happen. You can't survive without breathing. I also stated earlier that the autonomic nervous system is made up of 3 divisions: the sympathetic, parasympathetic, and enteric nervous systems. We will cover the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. However, for now, all you need to know is that the enteric nervous system is a mesh-like system of neurons that governs the functioning of the gut. First, the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system prepares your body for action. It mobilizes the body's resources during physical exertion or responses to stress. So when you see a giant dog growling at you and then launches at you, running faster than you've ever seen a dog run, your heart begins to beat, you begin to breathe rapidly, your pupils dilate, you begin to sweat, and you take off running to try to get away from the dog. This is your sympathetic nervous system at work. This is your sympathetic nervous system at work. It activates various neurons, allowing your body to respond this way. It uses a very specific neurotransmitter, norepinephrine, for the neurons to communicate with one another. We will discuss more on different neurotransmitters in chapter 4. Now you're still running from this giant dog, your heart is still pounding, you're breathing really fast and running like you've never ran before. You finally are able to turn the corner and the dog doesn't see that you turned the corner and keeps going straight, and you are in relief. Your breathing rate begins to drop, your heart rate begins to slow down, and your pupils go back down to the initial size, and you stop sweating. This is your parasympathetic nervous system at work. It is responsible for returning your body to a normal resting state and begins to replenish the body's energy reserves. It also uses a specific neurotransmitter, acetylcholine, which we will also discuss more in chapter 4. And again, all you need to know about the enteric nervous system for now is that it has a role in the digestive system. Back to the CNS, which contains the brain and spinal cord. The spinal cord is like a relay center between the brain and body. The spinal cord receives information from the body's PNS, transmits it to the brain, and conveys the brain's motor commands out of the body. However, not all information that is received from the PNS travels up to the brain. The spinal cord contains circuits that perform local processing and control simple units of behavior such as reflexes. This is why when you go to the doctor and they test your reflexes with the little orange hammer on your kneecap, it feels totally different than any other movements. It's not being processed by the brain, but by the spinal cord. Now, the brain is the center of the nervous system. The brain contains 2 hemispheres, left and right. Now, before we get started on the brain, let's clear some misconceptions up about the brain. You may have heard that people are left brain or right brain. No, we are all brain. We use both sides of the brain 100% of the time. You may have heard that we only use 10% of the brain. That is so far from the truth. We use our entire brain every day. So the brain is divided into 2 hemispheres, and to get a sense of how big your brain is, take your hands, make a fist, and place them to one another like this. This is the approximate size of your brain. Little smaller than you thought, right? Well, where the brain lacks in size, it makes up in intricacy. The cerebral cortex of the brain is the outermost layer of the brain and consists of nerve cell bodies and their branches. If you've ever seen a brain, you know it looks very wrinkly. Well, there are names for these wrinkles, a gyrus or gyri for plural. The space in between the gyri is a sulcus or sulci for plural. You can see the gyri and sulci here. Now, besides the 2 hemispheres, the brain can be divided into 4 different parts. I'll be using these terms throughout the semester, so please be sure to know and understand these terms or locations in the brain. The occipital lobe is the main processing center for vision. The temporal lobe processes hearing. The parietal lobe processes touch, temperature, and pain. The frontal lobe is key to higher mental functions. The cerebellum is important for balance. Without it, you'll be looking like LeBron James on the basketball court, just flopping everywhere. Man, just joking. Or am I? We will be discussing more functions of all these cortical regions of the brain as the semester progresses. In between the two hemispheres is a large band of axons called the corpus callosum. This allows for the two hemispheres to communicate with one another. This allows the brain to act as a single entity during complex processing. If you were to slice into a brain, it is obvious that there are two different colors. The outer part of the brain is the gray matter, which are neurons that do not have myelin around their axons. These neurons are responsible for processing information it receives from our environments. It isn't until the information is processed that you become aware of the environments around you. White matter is the interior of the brain and consists of myelinated neurons, which are responsible for sending information from one area of the brain to another so that the demyelinated neurons can process the information. The cerebral cortex is the outermost layer of the brain that, again, is made up of gray matter and processes information. It is also responsible for higher cognitive processing and consists of 6 different layers that are made up of different types of neurons that perform certain functions. They all communicate with each other through tracts of axons to process and transmit information to other parts of the brain. There are also many subcortical structures that lay underneath the cortex of the brain. The basal ganglia is a group of brain nuclei that includes the caudate nucleus, globus pallidus, and putamen. The basal ganglia is heavily involved in motor control, which is covered in chapter 11. However, we will not be covering this chapter this semester, but feel free to read on your own. Yeah, right. The limbic system is a loosely defined, widespread group of nuclei within the brain as well, which is crucial for emotional processing and learning, including memory. The amygdala is involved in emotion regulation and odor perception. The hippocampus and fornix is involved in learning and memory. The cingulate gyrus is implicated in the direction of attention, and the olfactory bulbs are involved in sense of smell. The limbic system is also made up of several other parts in which we will discuss in future chapters, and you can see it has many vastly different functions. Just so you can get an idea as to where the basal ganglia is located, here is a figure to show where. Oh, y'all ready? Let's go. As with the previous figure, this is the limbic system, so you can get an idea as to where it is located in the brain. You can see some of the other parts of the limbic system pictured here as well that we will discuss. One in which we will touch on now, the thalamus. The thalamus was the big purple region in the previous slide. Feel free to go back and see for yourself. I like to refer to the thalamus as the crossing guard of the brain. Most sensory information passes through the thalamus and directs it to the proper areas of the brain for further processing. The hypothalamus lies directly below the thalamus and is rather small. However, it plays a large role in many vital functions such as hunger, thirst, temperature regulation, sex, and many more. It also controls the pituitary gland and serves as the brain's main interface with the hormonal systems of the brain. We will be talking about the hypothalamus quite a bit in this course. The tectum of the brain has a role in sensory perception and is divided into 2 parts, the superior colliculi and the inferior colliculi. The superior colliculi has specific roles in visual processing, which we will discuss further in chapter 10. The inferior colliculi processes information on sound, which is discussed in chapter 9. Another chapter that we won't be covering this semester, but again, feel free to read on your own. The reticular formation is a network of neurons that is implicated in a variety of behaviors, including sleep and arousal. It is activated when we begin to wake up in the mornings to go about our day. The brain needs to be protected, and we all know we have a skull that does just that. However, right below the skull are 3 additional layers of protection for the brain called the meninges. The dura mater is the outermost layer from the brain. It is a tough layer that surrounds not only the brain but the spinal cord as well. The pia mater is the innermost layer and adheres directly on the brain and the spinal cord. It is the soft covering. If you've ever seen a lot of these cell phone cases that have a hard protective covering and an inside soft covering that absorbs impacts when you drop it, you can relate the dura mater to the outside case and the pia mater to the soft rubbery case. And then there is the arachnoid membrane. This sits between the dura and pia mater and is a spider web-like substance. It allows the brain to be suspended in cerebrospinal fluid which surrounds the entire brain. The brain is not set in one spot, but actually just kind of floats in your skull. The blood-brain barrier is a highly selective, semi-permeable membrane barrier that separates the circulating blood from the brain and extracellular fluid in the central nervous system. This means that it only allows certain substances to pass through, such as water, some gases, lipid-soluble molecules, and some amino acid and glucose that is vital to neural functioning pass. It also protects the brain from infections and blood-borne toxins and makes delivery of drugs to the brain more difficult. However, this does not mean that viruses and diseases cannot pass through. There are exceptions. Meningitis is the inflammation of the meninges that is caused by viral infection and is potentially lethal. It is also a very contagious virus. Meningiomas are tumors that aren't usually cancerous, but if it presses up against certain parts of the brain, it can affect the functioning of that area of the brain, and a variety of behavioral issues could occur. Lastly, you have holes in your brain. Don't worry, they're supposed to be there. The ventricular system of the brain consists of 4 chambers in the brain that is filled with cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. CSF has 2 main functions. It acts as a shock absorber since the brain is floating in it instead of fixed. This means the brain is protected from sudden movements of the head that would smash it against the inside of the skull. Second, CSF provides a medium for the exchange of materials, including nutrients between blood vessels and brain tissue. And this is it for the Chapter 2 lecture in biological psychology. I'll see y'all online. Ciao. Types of tumors that may or what are you talking about, dude? The PNS is the part of the nervous it contains 2 hemispheres, left and right. Now, before I get started on the brain, let's clear some misconceptions up about stupid.